Hi everyone, just wanted to hop on here before this first post-Pesach episode with some information about the podcast and the some programming notes. First of all, I've gotten some nice feedback on the Mishpacha article interview about the podcast and myself. So if anyone has any more feedback, can email me sfarmchatter@gmail.com, and I'll put a link to the article one more time in the show's notes if anyone is interested in checking that out. Now, for the podcast, it's going to be still, the regular episodes coming out over the next, going forward, and a variety of different topics. If anyone has guest suggestions or anyone, wants to sponsor an episode, please email me, farmshed@gmail.com. As well, if you want to sponsor an episode, there's also in the show's notes, there's a link through PayPal. It's on the website as well. Also, regarding a programming note, the series on Spain and Spanish Jewry, which is roughly, I'll talk more about this in the intro when the series begins over the next, and I'm not sure exactly when, but it'll be some point over the next couple of weeks, but it's going to be about the beginning, Jews of Spain under Muslim Spain, Reconquista, Christian Spain, and then the riots of 1391, and then there's going to be on the Inquisition, and there will be about the Converso, Marrano, New Christian, we're going to call them, the expulsion in 1492, the forced conversion, expulsion of Portugal in 1497, and then after that and so on. So there's going to be South America, there's going to be a lot in there. I'll talk more about this at length, again, when this series starts. It's 20 episodes as of now, it may even get bigger, but it's 20, and there'll be some other ones, associated with it. Generally, that series as well, the podcast won't become Spain chatter. That series will be like with the Shabbos series in the past. It will be on Wednesdays. I think it will be. The Sundays will be a standard episode. Wednesday will be the Spain series. There may be a little bit different here and there, but generally, that's how the series is going to go. If anyone has any. Obviously, you don't know the different episodes and what the topics I'm covering, but if anyone has guest suggestions, topic suggestions for that, you can still email me, sfarmchatter@gmail.com. It could be I can still incorporate it into this series. Something else that I'm going to be doing is as like a sidebar. Some of those Sundays episodes will be, for example, I have already recorded a biography on the Rosh, on the Ramban. So those will be separate. They're not part of the series, but Gittin lived in Spain. They're separate things. They will be, kind of concurrently with the series, something like that. So do you have anyone has suggestions for things like that? Email me in general for this series. You can reach out and email me. So stay tuned for that, as well as, again, regular episodes, suggestions, things like that. Feel free to email me. And if anyone is, for any new listeners and old listeners as well, especially if you listen on Apple, if you can rate the podcast and if you could review it as well, it is much appreciated.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Sfarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Dr. Akiva Sternberg, who is the author of a number of books on the history of halacha, and including his newest one, which is titled Eretz Lo Nodat, or in English, Terra Incognita, Halachic Challenges of the Jewish Immigration to America, 1850 to 1924. And as we'll see, there's a lot of selections from Sfar. There's a lot of things taken from Shalos Chuvas, from the time period. So there's a lot of really interesting historical and, as I said, history of halacha things in the book. So thank you, Dr. Sternberg, for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Okay, let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Sure. I was born in Boston many years ago. In my childhood and adolescence, I was raised both in Boston and in Israel on and off, a year or two here, a year or two there. Most of my adult life has been in Israel. I was trained as an economist. I have a bachelor's degree in economics from Johns Hopkins University and a PhD in business administration from Bar Ilan University. And my professional career has been in senior positions in the Israeli banking industry, and as a lecturer in the Reichman University in Herzliya. But throughout my professional career, I've also invested time in the study of the history of halacha. And as you said before, I've published a number of books on that topic, the last one being the book Eretz Lo Nodat.
Okay. And then perhaps at the end, you can mention the other ones if you want to at the end of the podcast. So how did you become interested in halachic history? Like you said, your working life, so to speak, is different as in economics, not in this.
Right. I think there are three dimensions that I can sort of answer that question. The first is just by studying halacha. Anybody who even opens up the Shulchan Aruch or the Mishnah Berurah or any other halachic book and looks at the halacha can actually see changes in halacha over time. In other words, things that were practiced in one way, certainly in the time of the Gemara, we don't necessarily practice them the same way today. That means, of course, that there have been changes in halacha, which means there has to be a history. There has to be a reason why things have changed. And in a number of issues, we know the reasons. I mean, simple examples like the issue of a prusbul or cherem de Rabbeinu Gershom, which changed many facets of Jewish law. We know the reason why these things happen, why these changes have actually occurred. But in other issues, we don't actually know the reason, and one has to sort of look into the history of why things have changed. The second dimension, I think, is just by looking about how people implement halacha. You can find things written in Sifrei halacha and see that people are actually practicing halacha differently, even without a halachic basis for it. One of the examples I give in a different book, in one of my earlier books, is in the introduction to one of my earlier books, is the question of how much time do you wait between meat and milk meals. And we know that there are essentially two halachic positions on that. One is a very short time of 1 hour, and the other is a very lengthy period of time of 6 hours. Those are the two halachic opinions. But we know that there are many people who practice waiting 3 hours. And the question is, where did that actually come from? And when one examines the origins of that, we find that that happened as a result of changes in the way people ate meals. What time were they eating meals during the day, and how much time did they actually have between meals? And that leads to the additional question of what other halachic practices have been influenced by external factors. And the third dimension of this is, I think, my childhood. Throughout my childhood, I would listen in to the shiurim that my father gave, and he based most of his shiurim on tshuvot from various periods. And it was very clear from those shiurim that there were historical events that were affecting halacha, and that made me become extremely curious as to how halacha dealt with historical events, or how historical events actually changed halacha over time. So I think it's a sort of a combination of all three of these factors that got me really interested into this issue.
Now, this book, as I mentioned earlier, is about North America, the immigration to North America. Again, the book is between 1850 and 1924, and we can get into those dates. But just in general, how did you get involved in this specifically to write this book? And I'll say the book is about, it goes to around 700 pages, but I think that's with the indices and the English summary. It's a little bit over 600 pages, so it's a big book. How'd you get involved in this?
Right. Well, that's a great question, because this book, or the topic of this book, I came across actually by chance, completely by chance. I've been working on a completely different topic involving the 19th century and halacha in the 19th century, basically trying to understand how halacha dealt with technological advances in the 19th century. The 19th century was one of the greatest times of change in a technological sense, and halacha had to deal with those changes. And I was gathering information about that topic. And how do I gather information? I have to read through all of the Sifrei Shutim, the Shelot and Shuvot of the rabbis of the 19th century. Not just looking at the indices, but actually reading one by one the Shuvot, because sometimes there are things that are hidden between the lines or in between the lines, and sometimes you find things that are sort of an appendix to a tshuva, which isn't actually the topic. So I was reading through the Sifrei Shuvot of the 19th century, and as I was reading through, I noticed a large number of tshuvot by various rabbis that mentioned America. Now, at the time, it wasn't of great interest to me, but I said, this is interesting because it repeats itself again and again. And I said, okay, I'm just going to make a note to myself that there are many tshuvot about America. And luckily, I also wrote down where these tshuvot actually appear. Then, a couple of years ago, I read an interesting article about the immigration to America. The article had nothing to do with halacha, but I just found the topic itself to be very interesting and fascinating. And then I read two books, two very important books about the immigration to America. One, The World of Our Fathers by Irving Howe, which is a sociological history of the Jewish immigration to America in the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, and another book which is actually fictional by Abraham Kahn called The Rise of David Levinsky. And in these two books, they mentioned various issues that had to do with halachic problems, things that had to do with Shmirat Shabbat, things that had to do with women who were left alone. And then I said to myself, wait, this is very interesting. Let's go back to those tshuvot that I came across by chance, and let's see what they're actually talking about. And I found a connection between these two historical books and the halachic tshuvot. And then I said, I'm going to widen my search. And I read huge number of sifrei tshuvot and halachic books and gathered, and I realized that I have a real story to tell, not only a historical story, but a very interesting halachic story that nobody's nobody's told until now, and that led to writing this particular book.
I want to just ask one more thing before we delve a little bit more into the book. Is that I know you mentioned there's a personal connection here. You write this in the introduction in English and Hebrew. I don't know if you want to mention that here.
Yeah, I think that in my subconscious, apparently, I probably, as I wrote this book, realized that I'm writing about myself, or if not myself, my forefathers. As I mentioned before, I was born in Boston. My father was born in New York. My grandfather was born in New York. But my great-grandfather immigrated to the United States in the last decade of the 19th century from a town named Stry in the Ukraine. And the little information that I have about him comes from snippets of papers and booklets that were in a little box shoved on some shelf in my parents' house for many, many years. And when I opened the box, I realized that he's telling a story as well. My great-grandfather, as I said, immigrated on his own, like many immigrants. He came to New York penniless. He started out in a low position in an import-export of fruits and vegetables on the Lower East Side. And then he worked his way up in the business world to become an insurance broker and became actually quite prosperous and enabled his family to buy real estate both in New York and in other places. So this is sort of the classic story of the movement of an immigrant from Europe to the United States. But it's not only on the economic side, it's also on the Jewish identity side. So despite the fact that he immigrated, he fought quite vigorously to make sure that both he and his children and then his grandchildren would remain from Jews who were practicing halacha, even though they immigrated to the United States with all the problems involved. So I found it interesting that after I had written the book, I really understood that I'd written a book describing not only the halacha but also some of my own personal history.
Okay, now the book, as mentioned, the time period that you looked at historically and the tshuvas and those things it's from 1850 to 1924. How did you pick those years specifically?
Yeah, there's a difference of opinion among scholars as to when the mass immigration started. The Jewish mass immigration started from Eastern Europe to the United States. There are some who ascribe to the opinion that you have to look at events that occurred in Europe, in Eastern Europe, and based on those events, decide when that mass immigration started. So one opinion is that in 1881, Tsar Nikolai II of Russia was murdered, and there were massive riots and pogroms against the Jews. And there are some who say that that is what started the mass immigration to America. Another opinion is that there was an agricultural failure in the Ukraine in the late 1860s, and that caused famine and disease, both among the Jewish population and the Gentile population. But the Jewish population, which was based mainly on that agriculture, had to move away. Some moved to the cities in Poland, but others moved to North America. There are others who say, no, let's just look at the numbers. And we have to understand this mass immigration was the greatest movement of people in a peacetime period. Over 2 million Jews immigrated from Eastern Europe to America in the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. But over 70% of them came to America after 1900. So there's some who say that the mass immigration started as late as 1900. But I don't go either way. What I do is I try and look at what the rabbis were doing, and when are there questions being asked and answers being given about problems that arise from that immigration. And we can find that as early as the 1850s, both the Maharam Shik and Rabbi Natan Zon and the son of the Khatam Sofer, Rabbi Avram Shmuel Sofer, are answering questions that relate to the immigration to America. So clearly this was an issue that was being dealt with as early as 1850. So I look at the period starting in 1850. The end of the period of immigration is easier to define because the American Congress in 1924 passed the Immigration Act, which in essence stopped all of the Jewish immigration, or almost all the Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe. So the end of the period is easy to define, 1924, and I just start when the Halachic authorities start dealing with this issue, which is somewhere around 1850.
Okay, now, as can be expected, or as some listeners may know, there are especially were a lot of issues, halachic issues raised by this immigration, especially as a lot of men left their wives and families behind. You even have some instances of women going the opposite, but there was lots of different things going on. There was no telephone, no internet. It was life was very different, and this led to a lot of halachic issues. So let's give a general overview of the halachic issues caused by the migration from Europe to America.
Yeah, I think we can define them into two broad categories. One is social issues, and the other is issues related to agunot, to women who are left alone without a solution to their predicament. The social issues were a result mainly of the clash of values and culture between Eastern Europe and the society that they came to in America. These problems were related to issues of shmirat mitzvot, Shabbat, kashrut, adjusting to the American culture and ethics, issues regarding people's business, could they charge interest or not charge interest, and various other issues that had to do with how people found employment. The other category is issues related to agunah. As you mentioned, in many cases, the immigration was done gradually. Usually, the head of the household, the husband, the father, immigrated first to America, usually alone, to set things up, to find a job, to set himself up economically, and then send money for the rest of the family. Now, this had the potential for the women to be left as agunot, either intentionally or by chance. We have to understand that when one immigrated to America, we're talking about the travel of about 2,000 kilometers overland in Europe, across a number of borders, and then crossing the Atlantic to get to North America, usually to New York, not only but to the eastern seaboard. And at times, ships sank on the way. and women were left in limbo without knowing what actually happened to their husbands. But even if the husband reached America, sometimes they just disappeared. They may have disappeared because they had an accident in their work, on their job. They may have disappeared because they decided that they don't want to have anything more to do with the wife and the family that they left behind in Europe. And therefore, we find many, many cases of women who were left abandoned and needed to resolve their terrible plight. They were left alone in Eastern Europe, unprotected and without any source of income. And the estimates made by historians about the number of women who were left as agunot is that roughly 100,000 women over a time period of about 40 years, which is a huge number of women, a huge number of cases that the rabbis had to deal with. So this was no longer a problem of one particular or individual woman, but it was a broad crisis of a magnitude that had never been experienced before in Jewish history. And when one looks at how the rabbis dealt with it, it's clear that the halachic authorities identified the scope of the problem, and they tried to introduce, as much as they could, innovative solutions that at times actually changed the accepted halachic practice, sometimes a halachic practice that has been in place from the times of the Gemara. In other words, there are halachot that we see that were changed in order to resolve some of these issues, despite accepted practice for over almost 2,000 years.
Yeah, and there's some really innovative and very interesting approaches taken by various rabbonim and Shals Shuvas, and we'll get to that. I'm sure specific stories, many really interesting specific stories related here. You mentioned the ship sinking at sea. I know there's specifically the SS Cimbria, SS Elbe. I don't know if you want to say those specific stories and halachic questions that arose from those tragedies at sea. Okay, so as you said, a lot of times the men left alone, and this was done. I don't know if you emphasize this, why this was done, that they left specifically. It was in order to start getting things started, making money, send money back home.
Yeah, the main reason was economic. In other words, we find again and again in the tshuvot themselves. In other words, one can look at the historians who describe this, but even when one looks at the tshuvot themselves, and you see the opening statement of the tshuva where the case is described, the description is of a person who could not find or gainful employment in their local town or village or city, and decided to immigrate to America. And one has to understand, when such a decision is made, it means that people thought that this was a viable alternative, even though the distance was huge. But the main reason that the men immigrated to America was economic. There were other reasons. There were people who left for personal reasons. They no longer wanted to have anything to do with their wife, and this was the way they found a solution to run away. There were cases where the husband, for example, was living in Austria, but he had Polish citizenship, and the Austrian authorities wanted to send him back to Poland, where he might have to go to the army, etc. So they ran away to America. There were other reasons as well, but the main thrust, or the main reason behind the immigration to America, both by men and sometimes women who went first, was an economic reason more than anything else.
Okay, so we can dive in a little bit more, I think, to the specific issues presented. I mean, as you mentioned, there was the two broad general issues, and I should mention agunah. You have on the front cover, there's a picture of an older woman contemplating in thought. I don't know if you want to talk about the cover, but that's obviously supposed to represent that agunah.
The cover of the book has a picture which is a painting painted by a painter from Belarus in the beginning of the 20th century, a painter by the name of Yuda Pen, and the name of the painting is A Letter from America. Okay, and what she's contemplating in that letter, we don't know, but we can just imagine. Okay, so
a number of issues arise. You said the more social issues. We can start with those before delving into agunah. As you put it, Bein Ha'olamas is a between two worlds when the Jews arrived in America, and then that's going to get into kashrus, making a living. Obviously, the famous or infamous Shabbos, Shmir Shabbos, Chil Shabbos, working on Shabbos issue. So we can get that. So if you want to just start off talking about it, and you can mention the very specific shalos teshuvos or any very specific stories. I want to just say something about the book for a second before I let you answer the question, is that the book you did very interesting is that, so we have kind of throughout the chapters, whenever you're quoting the source, the original source, whether that's the tshuva or other cases here, it's Eisenstein, J.D. Eisenstein, you bring in a whole, you kind of bring like a block quote in the middle. So you have your kind of writing, the book, and then you'll bring the source with a block quote, I guess is the best way to explain it. So people who are reading the book can kind of jump around and kind of skip the source if they wish. But the nice thing is, other than just bringing the source and say, go look over there, and someone would have to have a computer or they would have to have all the svarim, they can actually read the source inside, which is a very nice thing. But okay, I'll let you answer the question. I just wanted to emphasize that already. Listeners understand.
Okay. Thank you. About the social issues. The truth of the matter is that the social issues began even before the immigrants arrived on American shores. There's an interesting tshuva of Rabbi Dov Levin from the Ukraine, who happened to come to the ports in northern Germany. He doesn't explain what he was doing there. He may have been on his way to America, but there's no evidence that he actually came to America. But he came to the ports in northern Germany, and he met the immigrants who were waiting to get on a ship to get to America, and they were extremely upset and frustrated. And the reason was that apparently the ships to America left the ports in Germany twice a week, on Tuesdays and on Shabbat. And those immigrants who were Shomer Shabbat and who wanted to keep their heritage were required to get on the ship on Shabbat, which is against accepted halachic norms. According to the halacha, you're not allowed to get on a ship on Shabbat unless you were on the ship on Friday before, etc. I don't want to get into the halachic details of it. But these people found themselves in a very unfortunate circumstance where they had to, for the first time in their lives, actually be mechal of Shabbat, even though they weren't interested in doing that. And Rabbi Dov Levin discusses the issue, and in the end gives them a heter to do it. Again, I don't want to go into the intricacies of the halacha on this issue, but it's clear from his tshuva that he understands that there's no choice. In other words, the alternative is to tell these people either not to immigrate or wait for another boat or another ship. But these people are penniless; they can't afford to buy another ticket, etc. And even when they got on the ship itself, they ran into issues that they've never encountered before. You had men and women mingling together on the ship. You had people who were making fun of the Jews who were putting on talit and tefillin in the morning. They had issues of getting kosher food on the ship. How would you get food? I mean, again, it's not a flight like we take today, which is 10 or 11-hour flight. We're talking about a trip that takes between 10 and 14 days overseas. And there were Jews on the ship who claimed that since America is the land of the free, we no longer have to ascribe to Jewish religion or halacha, etc. And then they arrived in America. And when they arrived in America, they discovered that they also had a big surprise or a clash of values. There were stories about people who were trying to build a sukkah on Sukkot, and people were throwing stones at them and making fun of them, etc. But I think there are two major issues that they had to face. The first was the issue of kashrut. How do you get kosher food? How do you get kosher meat? Especially those immigrants who weren't living in the major cities. I mean, in New York, in Baltimore, and in other major cities in eastern United States, there was essentially no problem of getting kosher meat. But when you left those major cities, when you went out into the Midwest or into the southern United States, it was much more difficult. And there are a number of tshuvot, again, which try and balance between the various issues and values, which describe people who want to eat kosher food. They want kosher meat, but the only shochet that's available is not shomer Shabbat. And then the question arises, can you rely on this person's shchita? And again, if this question was asked 50 years before in Europe, the answer would have been clear. The answer would have been no, you cannot rely on this person's shchita. But here the rabbinical authorities understood that you have to sort of balance out between something good and something bad. On the one hand, you want to rely on this. If you don't rely on this person's shchita, then what's going to happen is that people either are not going to be eating meat, or in the end, what they'll turn out doing is eating non-kosher meat. So most of those who dealt with this issue decided to enable one to rely on that shchita, assuming that there's some sort of person who can oversee what he's doing, and assuming that this shchita is on a personal basis and not somebody who's running a slaughterhouse. But I think the biggest problem facing the immigrants coming to the United States was the issue of Shmirat Shabbat. In general, in the 19th century, the issue of Shmirat Shabbat was not new. People in Europe were leaving their ancestral customs for tens of years, and the rabbis were fighting that. But here in the United States, for the first time in Jewish history, people were forced to work on Shabbat. People were forced to be mechalelei Shabbat, even though they would have preferred not to do so. There are many, many stories that the rabbis documented about people who wanted to keep Shabbat, but were not able to do so. One of them is a story that's written by Rabbi Gedalia Silverstone, originally from Lithuania, and then he immigrated to America. And he describes a horrible story about a tailor who comes with his family to America and wants to find a job, and he gets a job, and on Friday he says, I'm going home, and the foreman asks him, where are you going? And he says, well, it's Friday afternoon and it's Shabbat. And he says, okay, you can go home, but don't come back on Sunday. And he says, okay. He goes home, and he tries to get another job, and he's not able to. And he goes into a description of how this person sells all of his belongings and loses his ability to pay rent. And his family's out on the street in the winter, and they're starving. And in the end, this tailor succumbs to the economic pressure and goes to work on Shabbat. And this is a story which is typical of many, many immigrants who had to find employment in America. And as a result of that, we find that a large proportion of the population was no longer Shomer Shabbat in the way that they were certainly in Europe, or in the way that the rabbis expected. Now, the rabbinical authorities in Europe were aware of what was going on in America. In other words, they were aware that many of the immigrants were no longer Shomer Shabbat, but they believed that the reasons for this, and one of the rabbis who led this opinion was the Chafetz Chaim. They believed that the reason that the immigrants were no longer Shomer Shabbat was because of issues due to comfort, lack of knowledge, peer pressure, trying to make a better living or have a higher income. And they weren't really aware of the social issues and the economic issues that the immigrants were facing. On the other hand, the American rabbis were well aware of this. There are many tshuvot of American rabbis who understand or who express an understanding of what's going on. Just to give one example, Rabbi Shmuel Avigdor Avramson, who came from Latvia to America, was asked whether or not a Kohen who's not Shomer Shabbat, who's Mechalel Shabbat, can do Birkat Kohanim, go up to the Duchan in America, in Israel it's every day, but in America on Yantav, can he go up to the Duchan even if he's Mechalel Shabbat? And Rabbi Abramson was aware of what the Chafetz Chaim said about this. If you open up the Mishnah Berurah about this issue, the Chafetz Chaim says clearly that Mechalel Shabbat b'Farhesia cannot, a Kohen who's Mechalel Shabbat b'Farhesia cannot go up to the Duchan. And Rabbi Abramson has a great difficulty in accepting that opinion, and he voices something that's very rare. He says, and he lived in the time of the Chafetz Chaim, so he's not talking about something that happened in the past. He's talking about something that's going on in the present. And he says that he values the Chafetz Chaim's opinion, but clearly the Chafetz Chaim never visited America and never saw the social issues that the American Jewish population is facing and the rabbis are facing. And had the Chafetz Chaim come to America, he surely would have said that a Kohen Mechalel Shabbat can do Birkat Kohanim, and the rabbis were aware of the fact that by telling these people that they couldn't, they would further push them away from their Jewish heritage rather than help them be at least in some part of the Jewish society. And what's interesting is that in America, at least in the first half of the 20th century, you have a group of people that some sociologists call non-practicing Orthodox Jews. In other words, people who identify with Orthodoxy, but on the other hand, they're not necessarily practicing Jews. They're not necessarily Shomer Shabbat, not necessarily Shomer Kashrut. But when they go to a Bet Knesset or a shul on Shabbat or on Yom Tov, they'll go to an Orthodox synagogue rather than to a conservative or a Reform synagogue. And these types of people were joining Jewish organizations in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Both the Mizrahi and the Agudat Israel were expanding quite dramatically, both in America and in Eastern Europe. But many of their members, interestingly enough, were not Shomer Shabbat. Even the whole purpose of the organizations was to strengthen Shmirat Shabbat in Jewish society, and that created tension within the organizations. How can you have people donating money? How can you have people who are officials in an organization which is striving to strengthen Shmirat Shabbat when you have people who are acting contrary to what the organization is trying to do? And Rabbi Chaim Hirschensohn, who came from Israel to America, raised novel approaches and arguments to try and explain why all of the groups of Jewish society are in essence all kosher Jews, if we can say it in that way. And he challenged accepted halachic norms and practices. For example, he ruled that there is no halachic basis to refrain from drinking wine that was touched by Mechalel Shabbat, which, if you would ask almost any rabbi today, would say, well, that's accepted halachic norm. There are various issues about what exactly is a Mechalel Shabbat and which wine, etc. But he said that halachically there's no basis for that, to try and soothe over the tensions that existed between the various parts of the population. So I think the social issues or the problems that the Jews faced when they arrived in America were, on the one hand, very surprising for them, and I think they didn't expect this to be part of the issues that they faced. And the rabbis here in America were very attentive to the issues and the problems that the population was facing. So that's from the social side. But the most of the book and most of the issues that were raised had to do with agunot, with women who were.
Yeah, I want to just jump in before we move on to agunah. I want to jump in with a couple of brief comments. So first, you mentioned that it's interesting. They were all really interesting. Rabbi Silverstone. So that's on page 97, 98 in the book. The Akiva Sefer was called Pinim Yikarim. So that's something of interest in there. And the Chavetz Chaim, you mentioned Chavetz Chaim at length. He has a whole Sefer, Nidchei Yisrael, written about this, which you discussed at length. Like I said, you go through, you kind of mentioned your own thing, and you have the primary source. You have Chuvas from Rav Chaim Berlin, Thomas Hoffman, and then, like you said, you have the American, shabbos, the people actually there, the rabbonim that are actually there and discussing the issues going on there. Actually, okay. Now you can continue with the agunah. I just wanted to put that in before we move on to that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, the issue of agunot, as I said before, was the major issue. You had at least 100,000 women who were left in solitude without their husband, either because their husband was lost somewhere or decided to disappear. And the issue started, of course, with ships that went down in the Atlantic. I'll mention a number of outstanding cases, both from the tragedies themselves and from a halachic point of view. The first is a ship called the SS Cimbria. The SS Cimbria was a ship that was on the line from Hamburg to New York for a number of years. And on the 17th of January, 1883, the ship went down in the North Sea, north of Germany. By the way, how do I know that this is a ship that went down? That's an interesting issue in and of itself, because the tshuva doesn't necessarily tell you which ship it is. It just says a ship went down, and then the ensuing halachic issue that was raised by that. Today we have databases that you can search to find all of the shipping tragedies or shipping events that occurred in the 19th and 20th century, and you can actually pinpoint specific events. So I was able to cross between the halachic issue and the actual event that occurred, and then find the headline in the New York Times about the issue, which is interesting in and of itself. So the Cimbria went down in 1883. That was 430 people perished as a result of that accident. That was the greatest maritime accident until that time. Today we say the Titanic, right? But then we would have said the Cimbria. That would have been the ship that would have been known. And at first, there were a number of immigrants on that ship, and the women were left as agunot. They had to know whether they could remarry or not. And at first, Rabbi Yoshua Siegel, who immigrated from Poland to America, decided that without specific testimony that the husbands were on the ship and someone who actually saw them drowning, he would not allow the women to remarry. And as a result of that, these women were left as agunot for over 8 years. And then they petitioned the Gdol Ador. They asked Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector, Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan, to re-investigate their case or relook at their case. And Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan, in general, had many innovations regarding questions of ships going down. But in this particular case, he ruled that one could rely on the ship's passenger list. In other words, these people were listed as people who were on the boat. And the fact that there was a lack of communication between the husbands and their family after the ship went down, and given the fact that in what he called modern times, where there's a telegraph and there are newspapers, so people had ample opportunity to get in touch with their family, the fact that they didn't get in touch with their family was a testimony to the fact that these people had actually perished and died, and he enabled the women to remarry. What's also very interesting about his tshuva is in one of the opening statements, he praises the widows for remaining or deciding to wait for a halachic decision rather than making a decision on their own. Because there were women who decided after 8 or 9 years I'm fed up with this, and I'm going to get remarried without permission of the rabbis. But he praised these women for waiting for a halachic decision. Another case is not a ship that went down, but rather an immigrant who had immigrated to America was on his way back to Europe in July of 1889. This particular person's name is Asher Weinstein. He fell off the ship on his way back to Europe. He had immigrated to America, and he started out as an apprentice in a real estate agency. And then he just started to purchase real estate in New York and became quite affluent. But apparently the pressure from his work had a detrimental impact on his health. So he was on his way back to Europe to get rest and relaxation from his business. But he fell off the ship. Why he fell off the ship is not exactly clear. And again, the question was, could we allow his wife to remarry? And in this case, Rabbi Yosef Eliyahu Fried, who immigrated to America and was the rabbi of Kehala Dat Yeshurun in New York, decided that the woman could remarry. And he made two, I think, very important statements in his tshuva. One is that halacha cannot contradict common sense. If it makes sense that you saw the person falling off the ship, and it makes sense that he died as a result of that, one can rely on that. And the second, which I think is even more amazing, is that he said when we discuss the issue of agunot, we have to take into consideration the specific circumstances of each individual woman. So that if we're talking about a young woman who has the opportunity to get remarried and start a new family, we have to be more lenient than if we were talking about an older woman who doesn't have that prospect, which is interesting in and of itself. He sent his tshuva again to the Gedol Hadot, Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan, who approved of his ruling. And again, what I think is very interesting is that Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan gave his ruling only 9 months after the event actually occurred. So you can see that the rabbis are interested in moving as fast as possible to find a resolution to these issues rather than procrastinating. The third case I want to mention is the SS Elba. The SS Elba went down in January of 1885. Here also there was an immigrant on his way back to Europe. In this case, the person's name was Moshe Leistein. He was a hat maker, and he was going back to his hometown in Poland to expand his business, and the ship went down. And in the tshuva of Rav Shalom Mordechai Shvadron, he mentions ideas proposed by Rabbi Avram Yoel Abelson, who proposed that modern shipping completely changes the halachic issues regarding ships that sink or people who drown in the ocean. He claimed that the fact that there's modern navigation, meaning that ships no longer hug the shores of the ocean, but rather cross the ocean in the middle, or the fact that there are lifeboats on the ship, completely changed the way we have to look at issues regarding mayim she'en lahem sof, or issues of water and how people drown in the water, and therefore create a situation where most of the women whose husbands drown in the ocean or supposedly drowned in the ocean, one would enable them to remarry. And when one looks at the various tshuvot regarding ships that went down, one can find over 15 fundamental halachic innovations that changed halacha, that enabled women to remarry. So that's just one issue that people faced.
So some other issues related to this, before we get into the general agunah issue, are identification issues of identifying those, and then a technological advance. You mentioned the technology of the time, so photography, being able to use pictures.
Right. So the fact that ships went down was just one of the problems. Another issue was what to do when people just disappeared. People, you had a husband who went to America, had a job, and either you never heard from him again, or you heard that at his place of employment, there was an accident. There's a case dealt with by Rabbi Mordechai Yehuda Leib Winkler of an explosion in a mine shaft in Scottsdale near Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania, and there were hundreds of people who were killed in those mines. And there happened to be one Jewish immigrant who was working in the mines, and the wife was back in Europe, and she went to Rabbi Winkler and said, "I have a letter from my husband saying that this is where I work, and I've never heard from him again after this accident." And Rabbi Winkler had nothing to base himself on except for the wife's testimony. And he decided that despite that he had no other information, he would, based on that, enable the wife to remarry. And the rabbis had to deal with other issues. For example, can we rely on the testimony of government officials or of the rail companies? And what do we do with people who are giving testimony and they are not Shomer Shabbat? And what about women? Can a woman testify that she saw the husband die or was buried, etc.? And as you mentioned, there were technological advances as well. In the middle of the 19th century, photography was introduced to the world. Today, we take it for granted that we can take a picture of anything. But at that time, that was a great novelty. And Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Orenstein from Galicia was the first rabbi to approve the utilization of photography to identify a corpse. And this was later adopted by many of the leading poskim of the time, Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan, the Netziv, Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, Rav Shvadron, and others all adopted the ability to identify a corpse based on a picture taken, whether it's identifying the picture itself or comparing one picture to another. And we can just imagine that given the great distance between America and Europe, how that facilitated the ability to identify the husband who had disappeared. So in general, the rabbis found various innovative ways to try and overcome the problems of identifying or proving the fact that the husband had died one way or the other.
By the way, we've mentioned Shalom Mordechai Shvadron a bunch of times, referring to the Marsham for those not familiar. Okay, so now we get into, I said the general issue of agunah, but we talked already a bunch about agunah at sea. But in general, as you titled the chapter Makam Igun Gadla, I think in English you wrote Woman in Limbo. So, and this becomes in general, like I said, there agunah, but more than that, further we have gittin, and in cases where the husband is not lost, but when we still have issues with gittin, getting the gittin from America to Europe, as you mentioned, it's over 2,000 kilometers away. Letters are distorted. There are mistakes in them. This happens all the time. And document mistake regarding names, mistakes in towns and cities. But they didn't. We'll get this. I'll let you start off, with the general background and then issues with gittin.
Right. The biggest problem of the agunot was the issue of divorce, of getting a get, and it had a number of levels. The first was just finding the husband to get a divorce, and then getting the get from the husband for him to decide to give a get, and then getting the get delivered back to Eastern Europe. So just to tell a short story about one woman whose husband left her, and she hadn't heard from him for a number of years. And she finally was able to locate him in New York. How she was able to do that is not exactly clear. But she had a relative who was traveling to New York. So she asked the relative to arrange a get. And he met the husband, and he persuaded the husband to give a get. And the relative wrote back to the wife that he's arranged everything and he's coming back and he'll be the shaliach for the get. And the relative comes back to Europe. And the woman, you can just imagine her waiting at the train station or at the docks, waiting for the get. And the relative comes, and he doesn't have the get. And she asks him, where's the get? And he said, well, I'm sorry, the husband wasn't willing to pay the rabbi, the sofer, $1, which was the price of the get, and therefore the rabbi didn't release the document. Of course, the relative himself didn't feel any obligation in and of himself to pay that dollar himself. So you can just imagine the problems that women were facing when they tried to get the get. But even when they were finally delivered from America, they sometimes came with errors that accepted halachic practice up until that period would have deemed them as problematic and probably would cause the get to be unacceptable. And we have to remember that the problems that both the woman faced and then the rabbinical authorities faced was that it would almost be impossible to get another get from the husband, either because he had then moved on and you wouldn't be able to find him, or he just wasn't interested in being involved anymore with his wife. And the errors that they encountered were of various types. There were smudged or incorrect letters. One has to remember that a get is an official document, and if there are errors in that document, it's deemed as completely unacceptable and it's worthless. So there were errors in the letters or smudged letters that were coming in those gittin. There were sometimes mistakes or errors in the names of the wife or the husband or their parents. In other words, saying Moshe ben Yitzchak when it was Yitzchak ben Moshe, or other more trivial problems. There were mistakes in the names of towns and villages that people lived in, or the shaliach was supposed to deliver or was appointed in. And all of these issues, which weren't new, I mean, these problems had been in discussion in halacha for centuries. But now the problem was so great that the rabbis had to decide what to do with them. And another problem that arose was, even if the get arrived and there were no problems with the get in and of itself, sometimes the villages were so small that there was no beit din to convene to deliver the get. And then what would you do if you had no beit din? And like in the cases of identification of people who had disappeared or had died, also in the issue of approving gittin, we find more than 20 halachic innovations that changed the basic halachic tenets. And just to mention a few, the Maharsham enabled one to write a new get even without the consent of the husband. In other words, you have a get that arrived, there are problems in it, you want to write a new one, and he approved to write a new one even without going back to the husband. Tenenbaum assumed that the smudges that appeared in gittin arriving from America resulted from the humidity on the ships that were carrying the mail, and that originally the document was correct. And he also decided that in those small towns and villages that you could not convene a beit din, you could deliver the get even with one single rabbi. And just to give one more example of changing the basic tenets of halacha, Rabbi Binyamin Arya Cohen Weiss from Galicia was faced with the following problem. There was a young man who left his wife without telling her, and he went to America and disappeared. And his father finally found him on the streets of Chicago, and asked him to send a get to his wife. He told him, you have to do the right thing. If you're not coming back and you're not getting your wife to come to America, you should give her a get. And the son didn't have any real objection to this, but he said that he couldn't allow himself to have his new society know that he had left a wife back in Europe. So he told his father, you know what, if you want, you can write the get for her. I don't want to have anything to do with this. Now, accepted halacha from the time of the Gemara until then was that in order to instruct one to write a get, it has to be an oral instruction. The sofer has to hear the husband say to write a get lishma. And here was a written instruction. The son was saying, I have no problem, but I'm writing a letter that I have no problem. And in the end, Rabbi Weiss decided that in cases where you cannot physically have the husband state orally, you can rely on a written instruction. One can just imagine how that changed and facilitated the ability to get gittin from afar. And so again and again, we see the rabbis striving to find solutions, sometimes really changing accepted halachic practice in order to resolve the issues that these women face.
So you mentioned Rabbi Tenenbaum, which is the famous Chuvas Divrei Malkiel. Another one, this Rabbi Weiss is a favorite Evan Yukara. Also, I don't know if you mentioned the Beis Yitzchak, or basically the Shmelkis, who you discuss in here. You do mention that he allowed the use of the telegraph to send messages and receive information. He allowed that to do so. He allowed the get, even if they cannot approve the witnesses, the signatures. Another thing about gittin, I don't think we discussed this, that you mentioned about the motivation, the rationale behind, you mentioned some of the really unfortunate and horrible, horrific stories that we see behind why they were trying to look for new, halachic ways to be matzah the gittin, is because of some horrible instances that were going on in Europe, I guess, with the wives when the husband wasn't around.
Yeah, the women face two serious problems when their husbands left for America. The first was economic. In other words, they had nobody to support them, and until the husband actually found employment and sent money back from Europe, they were left without any income. But more problematic was that they were left without anyone to protect them, physically protect them. And women were being, I'll say it politely, were being harassed, both by their Gentile neighbors and sometimes also by their Jewish neighbors. And even when they tried to find protection in relatives' homes, they weren't always protected. And the rabbis were very aware of the serious nature of the troubles that these women were facing. And there were men who were also trying to find women and entice them by offering them both solace and some sort of income, and entice them in various ways. And the rabbis were trying to avoid all of these issues, and therefore try to resolve as quickly as possible and as innovatively as possible the various issues that they face.
One more gittin issue was the status of American rabbonim and American batei dinim. So even when everything was good about the gittin, that was a whole nother issue.
Yeah, but the problem was that there were so many gittin coming with errors that it raised suspicion as to the knowledge and proficiency of the batei dinim in America. And if you feel that a beit din isn't proficient, you can't rely on its get, even if the get is 100% okay. And there were various rabbis who dealt with this. One was the Beis Yitzchak, as you said, of Shmelkis, who ruled that you could approve a get even if you weren't able to confirm the particular beit din or those who were signatories to the get, etc. Because again, he clearly understood there was no way to get another get. Once you got one, was difficult enough to get to receive. To get another one was almost impossible.
Okay, so moving on to the next major issue, which is, as you termed it, indirect agunah, I think, which is the issue of chalitzah, famous issue. So in that case, when the husband dies and they're childless and there's a brother unmarried, and the brother has to do yibum or chalitzah. Not that we don't do yibum. So this raised a whole bunch of issues. I want to mention, maybe you'll mention it, but I'll let you talk about the general issue. But you have the story was just, and I read the story, it was really moving, a sad story. With a couple went to the Maram Shik, and they were potential newlyweds, as you're from Vienna. They were looking to get married, but they were worried. They didn't want to get married because the brother lived in America. So what was going to happen if the husband died before they had children? So that they were just nervous to get married. And it's just, I mean, that story just really sums up everything. It really, to me, like captured the time as much as we can't really see, but then we can kind of get a feeling of what was going on and what people were actually feeling and what they were scared and worried about.
Right. Yeah. The whole issue of chalitzah is an issue in and of itself, even before this time. I mean, there were many widows who were extorted for money by a brother-in-law who was requested to do chalitzah. He understood that he had an opportunity somehow to squeeze the woman for money. But here the problem became even more complicated. If you have a brother in America, first of all, you have to find him. Again, it's not like today where you just pick up the phone and you call him and you say, we need to do this or that. You have to actually find the person somewhere in America. You don't necessarily have any contact with him. And how are you going to find him? Now, even if you found him, you then have to convince him to do chalitzah. And he may not be committed anymore to Yiddishkeit. He may feel that he has no connection whatsoever. And why does he want to get involved in this? But even if you found him and he's willing to do chalitzah, who's going to travel 6,000 kilometers to do this in the Beit Din, right? I mean, the woman doesn't have the money to do this. The brother-in-law isn't going to travel all the way back to Europe. He has a job. He doesn't have the time. And again, we're not talking about a flight that takes half a day. You go and you come back. This is something that's going to take a huge amount of time. And we actually find tshuvot that the brother-in-law states that I can't do this because I just don't have the ability to do this. And therefore, the rabbis needed to find a solution. And there were 3 attempts to resolve this issue. And unlike the other issues of gittin and identifying people who had died, etc., these 3 attempts were not very successful, or not as successful as the others. The first is, as you mentioned, is the Maramshik. The Maramshik was approached, as you said, by a couple in Vienna who wanted to get married and were worried about the fact that they had a brother, that the potential husband had a brother in America, and what would happen if he died without children. And the Maramshik decided that they could get married and have a t'nai b'nisuin. They would make a stipulation in the marriage that should the husband die without children, the marriage would be annulled. That in and of itself is an innovation which wasn't accepted by all of the rabbinical authorities. But what's interesting to point out is that the Maharamshik, when he dealt with this in the 1850s, was dealing with one case brought to him by a couple in Vienna. 20 years later, Rabbi Avram Ablikatz from Slovenia deals with the same problem, but he describes it as a broad issue that many couples are dealing with. And the reason is, of course, that 20 years later, there were many more immigrants. So we were moving forward in time in immigration. But the problem with this solution, of course, is that you have to identify the problem before it occurs. In other words, either you have a brother already in America, or you know that you may face this problem. But what happens if you get married before you have a brother in America? And later the brother travels to America and you didn't have a t'nai b'nisuin, you're stuck with the same problem again. So the next attempt to solve the problem was perhaps decide that if the brother is no longer shomer Shabbat, he's mechalel Shabbat b'farhesia, you don't need chalitzah at all. And this is based on the halacha that a mumar does not require chalitzah. And there was a suggestion proposed that perhaps we should define a mechalel Shabbat b'farhesia as a mumar l'kol Torah, and therefore wouldn't require the wife to have chalitzah at all. Now, this solution, of course, could have solved many problems for many women, because since many, as we said before, many of the immigrants were mechalel Shabbat, therefore this could have been a very broad solution. Now, this was rejected both by Rabbi Aryeh Leibush Ish-Hovitz from the Ukraine and Rabbi Shvadron from Galicia. They both decided in the end that a mumar is only someone who actually converted to another religion, to Christianity, to Islam, or to something of that nature. But somebody who's just negligent in his religious practices cannot be considered a mumar, and therefore they rejected this as a solution. The third solution that was put forward was to enable the woman to appoint a shaliach for the chalitzah. The Gemara states clearly that chalitzah cannot be done through a messenger. But Rabbi Shlomo Hillel Frieder in the middle of the 19th century proposed that this would only relate to the yavam, to the brother-in-law, but that the woman herself could appoint a messenger because her role in the chalitzah is relatively passive, and therefore one should enable her to appoint a messenger. The Maharsham Rab Shvadron at first adopted this approach, but he retracted his position under great pressure from other rabbis. And for about 20 or 25 years, nobody actually discussed this as a possible alternative to resolve the issue of the need for chalitzah. This was raised again in the 1920s. Not many people know, but at the end, after the First World War, from about 1919 to 1921, there were major pogroms in the Ukraine. The estimates today are that about between 150,000 and 200,000 Jewish men were murdered in those pogroms. And that created a huge crisis of agunot, because you had both people who were killed and not identified, and some who were identified but died without offspring, and therefore the women needed chalitzah. And an anonymous rabbi from Russia raised the issue again and asked to approve to do chalitzah through a messenger appointed by the woman. He was opposed by most of the European rabbis, and the main proponent of this suggestion was Rabbi Avram Aaron Yudilevich, who immigrated from Russia to America. He wrote a whole book, a whole sefer about this, about his proposal. He sent it to the leading rabbis of his time, but most of the rabbis opposed this proposal, and in the end, the opponents prevailed. So, unlike the solutions that were found for gittin that came from America, or identifying people who had passed away either on the way to America or in America itself, the issue of chalitzah was not really resolved in a way that could solve the problem for the many women who needed this solution.
Yeah, Rabbi Yudlevich, the base Av. I think this is an Av B'Chachma. I know Shirley Bornstein did a whole raid bite on this in his the family share. I think the raid bite is called Once Upon a Time in America, but you can search on his app and you can find where he discussed this issue when the family was doing Kivamas. There's that is an issue, and then there are other things throughout the book. Something to mention generally speaking here is that and in the index you go through in the back, there's a mafteach, but you kind of just go through each. You can let you speak about it, but it's just mafteach tshuva essentially. You're just saying the name of the sefer, the author, and then the topic, and you just mentioned it. So I don't know if there's something more you want to say about that generally, or if you want to talk about, like, we mentioned a lot of the rabbonim. Are those like the main? Is there any specific tshuva sefer or rav or rabbonim that you use that you came across more often than others throughout this?
Yeah, well, what's interesting is that it's a broad spectrum of rabbonim who dealt with this issue. It's not one particular rabbi and it's not even a rabbi from one particular area. It's a very broad spectrum of rabbis who come up with various innovative solutions. There are a number, though, who dealt with this more, and it's mainly because they're the Gdolei Hador. I mean, it's clear that the Maharsham, Rav Shvadron, was asked many questions about many issues regarding the immigration to America, and similarly, Shut Divrei Malkiel, Rav Malkiel Tenenbaum, and Rav Shmelkes the Beit Yitzchak, the leading rabbis, were asked more than other rabbis for two reasons. First of all, they were the leading rabbis, and the more complex issues were brought before them. But as I said before, I think what's interesting is that it's not just those leading rabbis. It's a broad spectrum of rabbis throughout Eastern Europe who had to deal with these issues.
Okay, now another thing worth mentioning here is a couple other things. First of all, the book is written in Hebrew. Yeah, I realized there's a bunch of things. So the book is written in Hebrew, but you did include about 50-page English introduction to the back. Is that just a literal translation of the Hebrew introduction? You wanted to just everyone to have like a summary, at least for those who read just English can just access that, make it accessible to them?
Yeah, I since this topic talks about immigration to America, and I assume that some of the readers would have more difficulty in reading through the whole Hebrew text, I decided to translate, not really transliteral, but translate the introduction into English to enable the English reader to get an overview of the book itself. And I actually, in the introduction, each topic, I then say where that's written in the book itself, so that you can then go and read specific portions of the book or specific pages in order to see the different topics.
So this, being that this relates to America, was there any thought to write this in English, or is there any thought to translate this book and put this book out in English?
I've been asked that question more than once. I have to admit, on a personal level, when I talk about halacha, I have great difficulty talking in English. So it's easier for me to read and write in Hebrew. So I think sort of the compromise was to write this introduction in English.
Okay. Now, what about prior research, prior work? Is this kind of the first book like this that's on halachic history of the time of the immigration to America? And what books, just in general, what books came before yours? So how yours differed, and then what kind of you used, and where you can point listeners if they're interested in reading other stuff also.
Okay. This is the first book that I know of, and I've done research on this, and I've asked leading authorities on the history of American Jewry. This is the first book that deals in a comprehensive way of the halachic issues dealing with the immigration to America. I mean, there are many historical books about the immigration, and there are also books that deal on a specific level of specific topics, even halachic topics that were dealt with in the time of immigration. There's a short article written in 1904, so during the period of immigration, by Eisenstein, who talks about tshuvot up until that time that had to do with the immigration. But he just lists the tshuvot. He doesn't actually go into the halachic discussions. And since then, as I said, there have been various articles written about particular topics or issues, like can you turn a church into a Beit Knesset, issues of kashrut of Turkey, and other specific issues, but nothing dealing across the board with immigration to America. There is one very important piece of work written by Professor Kimi Kaplan, a book called The Orthodoxy in the New World, but he deals mainly with rabbinical sermons and ideological works, and only minimally to halachic sources. So this book is the first attempt to actually look at the halachic issues that resulted from the immigration to America.
Now, these tshuvas, so there's a lot of tshuvas in here, very comprehensive. I'm sure there are even those that you didn't get to. But how did you do your research? How did you find these tshuvas? Were you is this manual, computer? Yeah, how did you do this?
Okay, it's a combination of computer and manual. I had to make sure that I read almost all of the tshuvot written in the 19th and beginning of the 20th century that had to do with immigration. And I did that in two ways. One is by using databases. We have the Bar-Ilan database, but the Bar-Ilan database, the advantage to that is that you can do searches very easily, but it has the Sifrei Tshuvot that they have are of the leading rabbis. When we talk about all of the Sifrei Tshuvot from the 19th century, I also want the more esoteric rabbis, not only the leading rabbis. So in order to do that, I went through the books on HebrewBooks.org. But even that wasn't enough, and I used sources that were written during the era of immigration. Rabbi Meir Gardon thought that the American rabbis were not proficient enough in Hilchot Gittin, so he published a number of compendiums on tshuvot regarding gittin, and he didn't only list them; he actually reprinted those tshuvot, which enabled me to find additional tshuvot that you couldn't find either in the Bar-Ilan database or on HebrewBooks.org. And in addition to that, there's a book written by Ephraim Dainyard. It was printed in 1926 called Keilat America, which is a list of all of the Jewish books printed in America until that time. So through that, I could then go back and find those books and see what was written in them. And in addition to that, I used original sources from immigration itself that immigrants themselves described what was going on during their immigration to America. And in this book, I also used some external databases. I think I mentioned that before. One was a database of shipwrecks, or the New York Times archive, to try and identify the actual events that occurred that are mentioned in the tshuvot themselves.
Okay, so the last question is something that I've been asked a bunch here, is how people can buy the book, especially in America. I got a copy from Beagleisen, so I don't know if he still has copies or can get copies. But how else can someone interested in the book get a hold of the book?
All you have to do is link onto my website, which I think you can post with the podcast, and then you can order the book and it arrive efficiently. I've sent a number of copies to America, no problem.
Okay, so I will link to perfect. So I'll link to the website in the show's notes, and people can order the book that way. Thank you. So thank you, Dr. Sternberg, for joining me.
Thank you very much.